Hello and welcome to the SACCO Insight Podcast, where we amplifying people's voices. My name is George Ombado, the Executive Director of WOCCU. Welcome again to SACCO Insight, amplifying people's voices. Credit unions all over the world are used to empowering people and again, just making people's voices being heard. Credit union provides solution. Today, we are pleased to have the World Council CEO and President to join us. And World Council is a global body that works with the credit union across the globe. The membership is quite wide, and I'll allow Elissa just to tell us more about World Council briefly.
Well,
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The World Council of Credit Unions is the global body that represents credit unions and SACCOs and all cooperative financial institutions around the world. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but we have more than 80 national and regional associations that are representing the credit union systems in more than 100 countries.
So what influenced you to join the credit union space? What's your journey towards credit union space?
So I've been at WOCCU now for 3 years, and I've always worked in financial services, particularly looking at how do we design systems that work for people that are often left out of the formal banking system. So I'm not new to financial services, especially in looking at underserved populations at a community level, but I'm new to credit unions in terms of working in the industry. Although I've been a credit union member my whole life. I started my first account when I was 16, a savings account, thanks to my father. So I've always been a credit union member, but this is the first career move of really working with this industry, and it's been, I'd like to say, it's never a dull moment.
Okay. I like that your background is from the financial services. That just shows your ability to help us amplify people's voices when it comes to financial needs. Africa is a big continent. Today is probably the fastest growing continent in terms of population. It's a young continent, yet it's a continent that we might be having challenges around people getting financial service. There's a group of people that might not be able to get financial services, like the young people and the women. Do you see this as a profound thing across the globe in the work that you're doing with World Council?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the challenges that we face as a global society, that we have a growing inequity between who has access to financial services, but also other opportunities, job opportunities, access to education, health services, and a significant part of the population that is underserved or not well served by the banking community, by formal services, often coming from governments. So this challenge of inequity and how resources get distributed, and how do we try to accommodate the very significant population growth, certainly that we have on the continent of Africa. You know, the UN estimates by 2050 that 25% of the world's population will be in Africa, and by 2100, based on the growth rates right now, nearly 40% of the world's population. For me, that's stunning, because we have to be accountable to how do we create opportunity and education and possibilities for people that are coming into the world and deserve to have the same economic and education choices that you and I have. So I'm really passionate about those things. I think at World Council we've defined as a not-for-profit organization, We both advocate and represent credit unions, but we also implement projects directly alongside credit unions and other partners to really get at how do cooperative financial institutions serve the underserved, and we define that typically around migrants, refugees, people that are displaced, people on the move, which are record numbers today. Certainly young people, certainly women. There's a huge gender gap that has really not budged at all in the last decade. Despite a lot of promise and growth we've had in access to financial services, that gender gap has really been sticky. It hasn't changed. And then we also look at rural populations. And for me, I think that's particularly where SACCOs and cooperatives have done very well, is finding a way to stay in rural communities, smaller towns, and through the model, it's about mobilizing people's money to reinvest it back into that community. So that's we should be as good as banks in how we manage people's money, how we professionally manage and intermediate assets that we're trusted to hold. But we have to always be in the interest of those members and reinvest that profit back into communities. And that hopefully gets at some of the challenges we have of the flight of capital and the inequities that continue to grow. And certainly that's across borders, but that's even within countries, including my own, including the United States. That's where I think the possibilities of the cooperative model are strongest.
Okay, those are good points. When I relate that to Africa, we are currently trying to communicate that $1 in the bank should be as safe as $1 in the SACCOs. But we also know there are those challenges around the people either not trusting the SACCOs or with our thoughts that we want the SACCOs or the credit union to be financially sound. What are your thoughts around us or the industry seeing that credit unions should be attractive, particularly for those underserved communities? What are the strategies? Some people often talk about technology, but I don't know your thinking around this space. How do we get those who are underserved?
Well, I have two ways I'll answer that. I think the first is one of the most important roles that we play at World Council of Credit Unions is advocating with policymakers and regulators that we need an enabling environment for cooperative financial institutions to do what they do best, and that's serve their members, and that requires some flexibility and understanding what it takes for a smaller financial institution to serve people that are often underserved. And all the way to the Basel Committee, to the international standard setters that are in Europe, that frame the rules that really govern the banking sector. We advocate that those rules need to be tailored or proportionate to the size and risk and complexity of a smaller financial institution like a credit union. So I answer it that way because if you look at the data and kind of where we have growing credit union systems, it's where there's been supervision and regulation, and we're for regulation and supervision, but in a way that evolves as credit union systems evolves. And so the safety and soundness of credit unions is critically important, and that's why we advocate for deposit protection for small depositors as well as depositors in banks, right? That's very important. Having stabilization funds, these are tools that help us create confidence with our members, which is as important as the responsible leadership and good practices that cooperatives need to follow as financial intermediaries for hardworking people's money. On innovation and some of the challenges more from an operational capacity of credit unions, I think this is another thing that we have tried to look at. How do we ourselves create an environment for more experimentation, for innovation to happen, and that happens when you take a good idea that one SACCO is doing somewhere and you try to replicate it, and that's the power of networks. Mm-hmm. That's the power of associations like ACOSCA and bringing people together. Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of carbon footprint, so we don't need to fly all around the world to learn and to experiment. There's a lot of these tools now digitally that we can interact and learn and have shared platforms that allow us to look at using technology in a way that breaks down some of the barriers of how people access financial services. We are stronger when we try to cooperate, even if we can together compete with other financial partners that often don't have their customers' interests in the best light, right? I think that's credit unions at their best, is making loans more affordable, making savings attractive, and creating wealth that benefits the communities that we serve.
Okay. Interesting too. One of the things that I might want to comment on that when you mention about regulation, which I know in most of the northern parts of advanced economies, probably people feel regulation might be either too much. In the continent of Africa, we're at the stage whereby we need more of those to help us just see that the system is quite solid. You have in America the deposit guarantee scheme or the deposit fund. In Africa, I don't think there's any country, I believe there's no country that is actually implementing that. And if it's implementing, even the financial system, the amount of money that can be refunded back is often very, very small. And of course, we're trying to engage with the regulators in that particular space. But the question then that I want to ask that might be linked to that, when you have a deposit guarantee scheme or deposit guarantee fund, how does that affect the confidence of people in America to join the credit union system? Then secondly, linking that to technology. I know it's good to experiment, we need to get as many people as possible, but what are the risks that you've seen? I know it provides opportunity, but there's also certain risks that we're exposed to when you're embracing technology, or how cautious should we be when taking those risks?
Yeah. Well, on the first question, you're right. There is a pretty wide spectrum across credit union systems of access to deposit protection schemes. And what we see is in the G20 countries, large countries like the United States and Australia and Canada, Brazil, that credit unions have the same access to deposit protection as bank customers. And that's up to a certain amount. But it's about confidence in the system, and partly it's about a level playing field. But we have seen private schemes and other schemes that are tiered that recognize kind of size and risk, and it's really more around creating safety and soundness in a system where when there's stress, there's an ability to, with a stabilization fund or a liquidity fund, to manage some of the stresses that might come if there's an economic downturn or there's a crisis of some sort, right? So it's more around stabilization, not rescue. And it's part of building financial systems that work for everyone, especially when there's a broad spectrum of borrowers and savers in that system. So it's just good policy. And even for a small credit union system, 3 weeks ago I was in Ukraine, I was in Kyiv, Ukraine, meeting with the National Bank, the Central Bank of Ukraine, to argue for inclusion in the deposit guarantee fund of the country, in recognition that credit unions, even in the midst of a war, are some of the only institutions still lending to farmers, to smallholder farmers, to small businesses, to women who are having to start a new business. And so we've been able to show, even it's a relatively small sector, a fraction of kind of the banking sector, but having even a small threshold of deposit insurance gives confidence that this is a credit union industry that is there for a reason and allows it to grow at the same time. So it's very important. On the innovation question, innovation is more than digital, right? For me, a lot of it is around leadership and a mindset shift of how are we reaching, in particular, the next generation. There's a latent risk of credit unions everywhere in almost every country of a generation gap of membership. And that is not sustainable if we don't find a way to be able to attract young people. And a lot of that is the convenience of mobile. I think that's here in Kenya like it is in many of the developed countries and high-income countries. And innovation in looking at how do we leverage technology stacks that are cloud-based, that have firms that are managing cybersecurity risks, working through partnership rather than trying to build it ourselves or modernize alone. That takes resources, and that's one of the biggest constraints. But it's why we also talk about shared investment, co-investment. Where we see credit union systems growing, it's where they've been able to share technology platforms or back office or centralize, standardize certain operations. Brazil is a great example of that. They are growing 1 million members a year. But it's that standardization, simplification, using digital channels, alternative channels, the things that exist, the ecosystem is there. We don't see SACCOs plugging into that as quickly as they need to be. And some of that is a resource, some of that is a know-how issue. And that's really where the experimentation comes in, is, there's this idea of sandbox testing. For me, it's starting small, pilot testing, seeing what works with a small set of customers, members, and then being able to roll that out. And we see that happening. Certainly it's happening. Digital transformation is happening. But I think we're not always learning the lessons of those who have gone through it. And it goes back to that virtual collaboration, being able to share experience, being able to publish experience. One of the things we want to do is through series of webinars, through small case studies, ways we can learn demonstration models that are working that others can learn from and try to emulate. And for me, you manage the risk by staying small, by really listening to the member, by engaging young people. Many of them are digital native. I'm the older generation now. And so I realize that we've got to bring in young talent that will help us get to how to meet the members where they are now. And the next generation of members are very well ahead of where many of us are in thinking about how to interact with technology and how to look at financial services through your mobile phone, right? And we don't want to be left behind as an industry. We've got some catching up to do. But I think actually in many countries in Africa, the leapfrog opportunity is there, and you have strong demonstration models here that I think we can borrow from, even outside the SACCO industry. So I think that's the other thing. I find that we kind of look internal, and innovation happens by looking what others are doing, and is there some co-opetition we can do by collaborating and cooperating to compete and be able to take what we do best, which is purpose-driven lending, purpose-driven services, which because of that purpose and because of the cooperative spirit, that should be a youth movement, not just a cooperative movement. That's what I believe.
Okay. I've heard you say a number of times that the world is going to become, or it's becoming less predictable. And even in the conversation that you're mentioning, it's clearly you've shaped it well that the world is becoming less predictable. In our space, how do you think the credit union should respond with that when there's uncertainty? I know you went to Ukraine. There must have been something that influenced you to go to Ukraine. So what is it that we should, or how credit unions should be involved in that space?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that. I think first of all, we are living in a time of uncertainty, just looking at, political division, certainly economic challenges, climate crises. Probably every generation talks about uncertainty. But I think just the simultaneous challenges we face as a human society right now that certainly runs across borders means that we do have to collaborate and cooperate across borders, right? Because it affects the whole planet. Decisions we make where we live affects everyone, right? And for me, I think that opportunity in an uncertain world is where cooperatives can shine, because they're about the member and the community and serving the interests of that member and that community. Which means if there's a crisis that happens, we often see capital flight. Certainly we see banks and others pull back because the risk goes up. And so the staying power of a credit union in a community that is hit by a disaster, or whatever the source of that disaster, certainly that's the case in Ukraine, the staying power is, I think, the testament to why we exist for the members. But the resource constraints and the ability to weather a storm, I think, is where the collaborative effort of the movement becomes very important. And that's one of the roles that we play, not just at the World Council, but with the Worldwide Foundation for Credit Unions. In the time of a disaster, we try to the best of our ability to mobilize some amount of resource that allows a credit union to get through an emergency period, to keep the branches open, right? And we expect that from the whole cooperative movement.
Response.
I think that response, not necessarily on the emergency, but on the credit union's ability to stay open and stay on the ground. We're not humanitarian responders, but we are credit union responders to make sure that we stay with the community through crisis. I think that's a testament to the purpose and the potential of cooperatives. There's a number of other challenges, though, that we face, and that gets back into regulation, access to liquidity in times of crisis, access to technology and satellites where things don't shut down if you lose electricity. Really amazing examples in Puerto Rico where they've installed solar, they've had battery backups, they've become the power centers for their members when the power went out. You have to pivot and adapt. And I think that's where there's both the opportunity and the challenge of how do we get credit unions to pivot and adapt more quickly. And I'll bring it back again to that's governance, that's the mindset of leaders, that's bringing in young people who sometimes are more adaptable, right? That's the synergy that comes with diverse members of management that looks at different perspectives. And that's why I'm always an advocate for inclusive leadership, for getting more young people, more women, more diversity of different ethnicities, religions, the whole meaning of inclusion. When you get that around a management table to discuss how do we respond to this crisis, you have an enriched set of decision making that allows you to move and adapt and serve your member. And I think that's really where we have to push the future of leadership.
Okay, thank you. And I know what you mentioned just clearly shows our need to have a clear balance between social and business while we serve our membership. Next year has been declared the International Year of Cooperatives, and we have been doing a lot to promote the credit union system. As a leader for World Council, you are coordinating the International Credit Union Day. Next year, we are planning as a COSCA to have both SACCO Congress and ICU Day in 1 week, just to promote that. Just in a part in short, what should you tell the audiences on the power of credit union in their communities, in their lives? Because there's a reason why we are having those initiatives to amplify the voices of our people.
Well, I think you actually said it well. I think the purpose of cooperatives is to know that you're part of a much larger movement than just yourself and your SACCO or your credit union at home. And all the challenges we've talked about and all the opportunities really only come when we can be part of something bigger than ourselves, and we can have the power of people everywhere joining forces to try to address some of the social and economic challenges that we all face. So we are a massive global movement on a very tiny planet. And I think International Credit Union Day, which is on October 17th this year, and all the other ways we can join forces with the cooperative movement globally, that's an opportunity for us to really amplify the voice and try to push the movement forward. So I thank you for being part of it, and I hope to see you on ICU Day.
Thank you. That was another episode of SACCO Insight, where we had the President and CEO of World Council, which again is a body that represents the credit union system in the world. We had the person who is at the forefront to see that the world is embracing the credit union and promoting everything in the world to do with credit union having an impact within the community. Thank you, Elissa, for joining us here.
Thank you.
Thank you.